Hey everybody, it's Rajesh here.
And Tane here.
Welcome to our podcast, Baskets of Knowledge, Chats with a Difference. In our podcast, we invite guests from around the country and around the world to talk about how they got to where they're at the moment. It's about a journey, it's about an experience, it's about their life. Kia ora koutou, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Baskets of Knowledge. We hope that you are well, happy, and healthy wherever in the country or in the world that you're listening to us, because we know the world has had some ups and downs lately. So I'm thinking about you and your whānau and your loved ones wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the podcast again. Tane, how's your week been since we last had a chat?
Yeah, it's been good. Good to get back into things, obviously, after COVID, bouncing back from that. But it's exciting that everything's ramping up again. And, I can start to see things happening because it was almost that stagnation point where, it's too far away to start anything, before the year actually begins. But it was, it was one of those weird areas where you're kind of like, oh, do I start things? If I do, it's not, I'm just moving things around and it's not actually doing anything productive.
Yeah, and what have you learned in that time there? So on that stagnation, what has been the learning for you?
I guess the learning has just been to actually take downtime. I think we've talked about this before, but I think it's so key. With school starting up again and uni about to ramp up for a lot of students, it's about just taking that time and not feeling like you have to do anything. A lot of the time we go, oh, I should be doing something. I should be, getting ready for this next step, or I should be, reaching out to people. But there's only so much you can do. So I've found, reaching out to friends and just catching up with them, which has actually been amazing to find that time. And that's something that I need to, work on this year for sure.
Yeah, and the word should is very dangerous, right? We all of us are guilty of using the word should. We should do something. And the minute you hear the word should, it's because there's a comparative to something. There's a comparative to what you should be doing based on something, whether it's a cultural norm, family norm, a friend norm. So it's quite dangerous when we start using the word should to inspire us to do something as opposed to want to. That's a great learning, especially it's okay to do nothing. My learning for this week since we last spoke is as we go into a new year, everyone has goals. We spoke about those goals, and I was on a lecture the other day, and something stood out for me where the speaker basically said people people should have a word for the year, a word for the month, and think about how they use that word to incorporate and use into their life. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. So my word for the year / the month is consistency. And the reason I chose that word is because we all hear about getting motivated. Being motivated is all good and that's fantastic, but motivation comes and goes. It's an ebb, right? And being consistent, whether it's being consistent with the podcast, whether it's going to the gym, whether it's healthy, whatever it is, I've decided to use that as my word for the year, and we'll see how long that happens and how long that lasts. But it's a word that I can put into any context of my life. So I challenge you out there, as you all listeners out there, to think of a word that you'd like to have for the month or the week even. It doesn't have to be for the year. Just pick a word and see how that word resonates with you, not with others, but with you. Right. With that said, we can keep talking as always, but as we always say, it's not about you and I, Tane. It's about our guests. And to our regular listeners, you know that we are really privileged that we have access to some amazing people out there that agree to come to our podcast. And we scour the country and the world to find some people that we know will have an amazing story. And this is no different. This week, we'd love to welcome onto our podcast, Ellen. Ellen, welcome to Baskets of Knowledge.
Kia ora, Rajesh. Kia ora, Tane. Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to be able to engage with the wonderful mahi that you're doing in this space.
Brilliant. No, thank you for joining us. Ellen, for our listeners out there who don't know anything about you, let's assume they know nothing. What would you say Ellen is at this stage in her life? How would you summarize Ellen?
I think I summarized it quite well when I messaged you earlier on, I think it was yesterday, Prajesh, which is chaos theory, but chaos theory having order in it, and the combination of both order and chaos somehow culminating into something both surprising and yet also rewarding in some ways, let's say that word. In terms of myself. I could say myself on the basis of the things that I've done, but I come from a background researching in a thing called deconstructionism, which prefers to not just focus on achievements, but also just look at the essence and identity of people. So myself, I come from a communitarian background, which is quite rare from someone who would be considered in the Pākehā space, but my heritage is largely Southern Irish, and I come from a long lineage of teachers and educators who are all activists as well. And I like to say that teachers and educators rather than run in the bloodlines because typically there is a lineage of teachers in the sense that my grandmother's a teacher, my aunts and uncles are teachers, my mother's a teacher, my cousin's teachers, and my brother's training to be a teacher. So thematically, education has played a very key element in my life, but that's because human rights and the essence and respect for humanity has played a very key element in my life as a whole. So yeah, I think introducing myself is about championing human rights and the essence of people and supporting identity in these spaces and communities that stand for those things. So I'll introduce myself as that first, because I think that's more important than just a list of my achievements. So yeah.
No, I love that. No, thank you, because a lot of us, when you ask someone what explain themselves, they give you the job title. I'm this, but actually that's not who you are. That's just a job title. I love how you spoke about actually this is my job. I mean, you've got some amazing titles, but that's not who you are. That's understanding and acknowledging the stuff that you stand for, which is really beautiful. And the fact that education runs through your family, through your lineage is really beautiful, because I went to a talk a long time ago where the speaker basically said something just stood out, and they said, education is important. Doesn't matter what education is. People can take away everything in the whole wide world, but they can never take away education. And that's always stuck with me, because it doesn't matter what the education is, whether it's learning how to read or learning or getting a doctorate, or whether it's being a plumber, or education around that, no one can take it away. So it's really beautiful that you are in that space there. And it's a space that you're pretty passionate about. And if you talk about you growing up, Ellen, where did you grow up? You said you had a Southern Irish ancestry. Where's home for you in New Zealand, I guess?
I often get asked this because people often get confused as to where I'm from, being someone who has both communitarian practices and coming from a long lineage where hospitality is a very, very big and serious thing. And in terms of outreach to people, we are like a diasporic people in my heritage, which you feel very strongly because we were brought up knowing the issues of colonization on our people and on other peoples as well, who were allies to us in that space, particularly in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Huge respect for Māoridom within Aotearoa, New Zealand. Even though I've grown up in this country, a lot of my connections, not my immediate family in terms of my parents, but my grandparents were immigrants from Ireland, and there was this long-standing narrative that runs in our family regarding the importance of standing up against colonizing narratives. And so that played a very key role in my mother's education, because she studied under Ivan Snook, who was against the neoliberalization of education during the Tomorrow's School stuff that happened, which was basically the state trying to privatize education. But also she studied under Tony Waho, who was very actively involved in the Te Kura and te reo movements, and was very inspired by that, probably because of a loss of her own culture that she couldn't fully talk about in many ways. So yeah, I think the combination of that really led to a sense of feeling a warmth and invitation to be in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as someone who could contribute to a conversation which was familiar, and also support those and champion those who are tangata whenua, and also wider, those who have come to a space from having been in a position of oppression. So yeah, that was really embedded very strongly into that. And although I grew up in the Manawatu, we were given very much the mindset, which is you are a citizen of the world and you invite everyone into your household because hospitality is key. So it's not just education being that beautiful equalizer, I think, like what you're talking about, that beautiful space where we can all meet of minds from all of our different diverse backgrounds, but also the space where the community and the household and the family can act as a safe engagement a safe haven, so to speak, whether it be in the Manawatu or whether it be anywhere across the world, and really being open to engaging with all these different cultures through education being one of those key components, and through championing those who have been oppressed and giving them a sense of space where we can create voices that support. So yeah, that was kind of my growing up, although I was a mixture of, due to my mother's passion for education, both homeschooled and not homeschooled. So I had a mixture of like state schooling, private schooling, and homeschooling, because my mother created her own curricula. She has an Eastern heritage connection in her lineage, which means that she doesn't like the hierarchical structures within education that we engage with, where the teacher's at the front of the class and all the students are just sitting and passively observing. And she decided, after having been a teacher for a while, she wanted to create her own curriculum, went ahead and did that. And it's based on a philosophical sharing model that's very much similar to Akko, but more Middle Eastern than that. And that was my growing up, knowing that you could converse with people about their life stories and how that tied to our knowledge and our expansion of self and our ability to support other people. And then when I went into my traditional education experience within school structures, I found it very limiting in terms of the types of conversations we could have there. And yet there were some advantages to that as well. So it was an interesting environment growing up. I will be honest with you, Pradesh and Tane. I didn't have a normal childhood growing up. I grew up with a brother who had a really disabled childhood. He grew up with meningitis when he was 3, which left him permanently deaf in one ear, and as a consequence suffering from the impacts to brain illnesses, which you can get through that process. And that was one of the reasons and motivations for my mother homeschooling, in addition to her own passions. And you know, growing up in an environment where you see someone suffer that much and they haven't done anything, you know, you want to protect them and support them through that. So I guess all of that kind of culminated into the sense that it's important to uphold humanity first, and to see people for people, and to not allow prejudice or judgment or discrimination, to not allow our perceptions of a situation to dictate whether that be in the context of education or whether it be wider. So sorry, that was a very long answer to your question, but it's been an interesting life thus far, even in my childhood. So yeah, and it will be interesting to see how it continues as well. So yeah.
Please don't be sorry. That was actually really beautiful. There's so many threads in that conversation, which I guess lead you to where you are today. You know, the fact that your mom was educated by leaders in their field and inspirational thought leaders, which has obviously steered your life in a certain way as well, because of we're going to call them I'll call them thought leaders, because they're bucking the trend. You know, you spoke about, you know, the word normal schools, because there's normal school according to other people's eyes, but your education is actually a lot more rounded, because you've seen the world in a whole different way. And you know, the stories you might have had as a young person, because of your basically 3 different state school, private school, and homeschool, is probably more enriching than someone who's been in one system. And not saying there's a good or bad, it's just a different way of growing up. And this morning I actually had a conversation with somebody who's been homeschooled, and she went from state school to homeschool, and she just spoke about the difference of how there's no good or bad here. It's just when they were doing the homeschooling, they just found a lot more stuff that they could do that they were passionate about. Whereas in a state school, that they couldn't do that because, and you know, for some people that works, but for them it didn't work. So obviously for you, it's done some amazing growth for you as a young person, and also growing up with a brother that has a disability, like you said, through no fault of his own. You know, life throws these curves here, which again changes, which helps you grow as a person. And you know, when you spoke about being a humanitarian and a citizen of the world, I think that's increasingly, if we start saying that about everyone, then it takes away those prejudices. You know, like where you're from, straight away you have a prejudice, right? And then we use the word, oh, you should be doing this here because you're from this place. Yeah, it's quite crazy how that just all lines up together. So thank you for sharing that story, which is beautiful. And I'm sure as you go on, your story will have some amazing I guess outputs. I guess, you know, I don't know what the word is. It's going to be pretty special to watch you as you do what you need to do. So watch the space, everybody. We'll see what Ellen's going to get up to. But before we talk what Ellen's going to get up to, so Ellen has this pretty dynamic childhood, and as Ellen was growing up, was there something that just really stood out for her as something that was her passion, that was your thing? This is, you spoke about activism and prejudice. Was that something that you grew up with, or was something that specifically was your thing as you started growing up and going to school and I guess into university?
Yeah, it's an interesting question to ask, and I think it goes back to your comment regarding the should element. I think in society we get kind of duped into the idea that we should be achieving in a certain way that impresses just the onlooker. That to me is not true either individualism or true communitarianism, which are big words that just mean support of the individual and support of the people.
Yeah.
I think we end up in these scenarios where we are performing rather than living, and there's a very big difference. And I liked how Tane said earlier about the importance of sitting within yourself well, because I think when you sit within yourself well, life has the ability to not surprise you quite as much and to give you a sense of peace. And I think so often, I have a real love of Byung-Chul Han's The Burnout Society. It's a really good book if you haven't read it. He's a wonderful philosopher. He talks about how we've really been conditioned within, again, the big word neoliberalism system, to continue to believe that achieving is the way that we are going to get to a sense of change. And, achievement is not a bad thing, but I think it's probably not the entirety of us as people. When we think about the things that we truly value, achievement is like the outcome or like the process to getting to what it is that we want, which is community, whānau, the ability to connect with people, the ability to generate a sense of respect. My own journey within that space was, we came from quite a strongly religious community who didn't support my mother's voice in that heritage, and that due to my lineage is a shame. To repress the female voice is a real shame because she's seen as like a truth teller. So I suppose my human rights connection is in connection to that cultural I won't call it a norm because it's like a tradition, but it's also more than that. It's an embodiment. The truth teller is in that lineage, and to deny the voice of the truth teller, it's kind of like a Cassandra complex, is actually throwing us back into the sadness of division between each other. And my mother did that through education and followed in the footsteps of, I think you called them thought leaders, Rajesh, who were involved in that space, who were also in a similar situation, wanting to tell truth in an era where commercialism, privatization, regulation of systems was moving into deregulation, where there was less accountability and more inclination towards the focus on the business of business is business. A self-regarding system that bends back on itself. The amount of pushback that I saw on my mother in terms of the way that the religious community were treating her and my father, how they were treating my brother, how they were treating, like the education sector was treating my mother, technically with, I suppose, a degree of suspicion even within our family dynamics prior to actually reading her curricula, and MOE then saying, oh my goodness, your curricula is amazing, which took a long time for them to be able to admit. I grew up quite cynical of education because I had heard, the trade union conversations on the way that teachers have been impacted when they moved to the sort of privatized board structure within your primary secondary schools and things like that. And now I study that partly within the tertiary sector, although that's not my field of research. So I grew up in this environment where, I'd seen difficulties for my family quite significantly. I'd had quite a few difficulties myself concerning the way that I was perceived within the religious community, which was not exactly positive and not exactly generous either. And from that process, entered into high school very much of the mindset of, this doesn't matter. This is not important. I was a high achiever because my thinking was considered quite diverse. And so I was able to do quite a bit academically. But it made me even more cynical when I was achieving, which is funny because people see me and they're like, you're so positive as a person. And I said, most of it's like motivated from frustration. Positivity can also be, I am motivated for change. That frustration can be that call to change. It doesn't necessarily have to just be, oh yes, I'm feeling positive, therefore everyone should, because that's not always realistic. And I think we fall into the positivity trap, a bit like the burnout society mentality, where I always have to be positive. No, that's not true. You can also acknowledge hardship within your life, because we all encounter that. And I think to dishonor the fact that we encounter that is to dishonor the holistic part of our experiences and our ancestors' experiences, our heritage, our parents, our grandparents. So when I went into university, I started my Bachelor of Arts, didn't know what it was going to be. And I said two things to myself. I'm an Aquarius. I should never say these things to myself. I will not study education or politics. And look what I've ended up in, education and politics. I've discovered whenever I say I will not, maybe it's like the opposite of the should.
Exactly, yeah.
I end up doing that, which was not intentional, but I went into a very toxic university environment where my research was considered very original from second year onwards because of my orientation, which is largely what's called the postist movement. It literally means from postmodernism onward, and was using very up-to-date information that was not being used within the university sector at the time, to which there was a divide within my school, which was linguistics. And one half of the school is known as applied linguistics, the other half of the school is known as sociolinguistics. And while one side will teach the other side, they don't agree on pretty much anything because they have two different scholarships. So I got stuck into a bit of a situation where I was trying to, this is going to sound really weird, apologies for that, maybe it's more of the chaos theory invading in the space. I was combining some elements of quantum theory with the use of language to be able to analyze and capture political intentions in speech, which were found to be able to actually predict political behavior. But it wasn't fitting to do with the traditional mentality in linguistics. So it was shut down pretty quickly by the institution. And over that period of time, we ended up in multiple situations where the institution was pushing back on that work. And it just increased my cynicism, unfortunately. So as I transitioned into my higher education, I was very much every single day thinking, what is the point of doing higher education if we are not meant to be pursuing, the university in the traditional linguistics, and forgive my love of research and this element and being a dork to do with etymology.
Ellen, no need to apologize. No need to apologize. Yes, this is amazing. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rajesh, very kind. But yeah, the actual term university is actually to do with universal thinking. That's what the term originally meant. And we've moved from that into the situation where we're actually lessening our engagement in universal thinking. We're not inviting, that reciprocal learning. We are trying to impose, we're focusing on copyrights and patents when it comes to journal articles. We're prioritizing competitive funding between Crown research institutes and universities, and all of this type of thing that's going on. It's become very toxic an environment, in addition to the massification of education. That doesn't mean that's a bad thing. In the intensity of that space, we can actually do good things. And I've seen amazing things from some academics. I've seen some champions in that space, and I just absolutely want to celebrate what they've done. And I've seen some incredible research students and students in general. But that's really what paved my way, my cynicism and my I will not into the space of student politics, which was the next step of the ladder. So yeah, it was an interesting journey.
What a remarkable story there, because when you said it was in your second year when you had the research, and that's pretty, for people that haven't been to university for a second year to have a research project is like, oh, what is going on here? That's people are questioning that and going, oh, what is going on here? And I like what you said. Universities are amazing places. There's some amazing leaders in there, but there's also people and institutes that if you don't marry the status quo, it gets crushed down pretty quickly. And like you said, it's all about the funding models, right? You get funded based on what people know. And it's really quite scary to think that, hey, sometimes your amazing idea might be squashed, not because it's not a great idea, but just because it doesn't agree with the narrative that is going with whatever institution or whatever funding body is going to be doing that there. And I struggled with that when I was doing my postgrad as well. And so I empathize with you when you think about how when you just go, hey, you have an idea, but it doesn't relate with your supervisor. But hey, you just push through. And the thing is, you have those champions, like you said, those champions who will not let the fear of losing their job or let the fear of the institution stop them from voicing what they do. Because sometimes fear stops us from doing things. In fact, a lot of times, not sometimes, a lot of times fear stops us from doing things because you're afraid of, I might lose my job, or I might lose my scholarship, or I might lose this, so I just need to just buck the trend and just follow status quo. So it's people like yourself and other people that don't let that happen, that makes a change. Otherwise we'll be doing the same thing. But I'm going to go right back to something that you really, 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 really said, which I think a lot of people don't realize right now or forget about, is you don't have to be positive all the time. There's a push out there when you look at social media, any social media, everyone's all happy and smiley and everything's hunky-dory most of the time. Or there's this narrative that if you have a bad day, something's wrong with you or it's bad. But hey, life is not positive. You can be positive about a situation, but you don't have to be smiling the whole time. Like you said, you can use your positivity and cynicism to get you to move forward, right? And I went to a lecture, and Tana, you were at this lecture as well, where Susie Bates, the cricketer, said this really, really amazing thing. She gave us 5 things that she's learned in her life. And one of the things she said is, you've got to accept that life is difficult. And when you accept that life is difficult and you just accept it, things start changing for you. Because a lot of us don't accept that life is difficult. We expect, not accept, expect life to be rosy and hunky-dory all the time. And which is why when things happen, you go, this is not ideal. Tanya, do you resonate with that? When Susie spoke about that?
Yeah, definitely. I actually discussed it yesterday when I was talking to someone else on a podcast, and we, this came up for some along these lines, and we resonated with, talking, opening up and talking to people about when things are bad. And I said, if we simplify it right down, it doesn't have to be having these massive conversations, but it's simply when people ask, the simple question of how are you, just being like, actually, I'm not all right. And that just, it changes the scene for everybody around you. And that's not necessarily saying I need help, but it's you acknowledging that, hey, I actually am having a rough time. I'm struggling with something. And so you're setting the scene for yourself as well to actually go, okay, it's something that I need to address. Because, when we go around all the time and how are you? I'm good. How are you? Yeah, I'm fine. Everything's good. It doesn't actually solve anything in the long term, And so that's what I talk about, is just simply acknowledging it is the first step to being open to having, further conversations. And I think that's the biggest barrier for anyone, is, that first step of acknowledging that you are struggling or that you're not happy. And that's absolutely fine. And you're right. We talk about social media and we see all these highlights. And I think especially in the summer period when, everyone's on break, so you don't have the luxury of, going to school or going to work or going to those places where you actually connect with people in person. You just see all these highlights up on social media. So if you're not having a good time or you're struggling, you feel like you're the lost person in all this. So it's about, how do we open these conversations? And yeah, you're right. It simply comes down to just acknowledging, hey, I'm not all right. And it will open many opportunities to discuss it.
Yeah, and then you need your champion, right? You need a champion to go, okay, cool. Like you said, Tana, it's not that you need help straight away. It's someone just to acknowledge the fact that, okay, you're not okay. Cool. Thank you for sharing that with me. And I guess, Ellen, when you went through your journey, when you were fighting the system, you would have had that as well. You would have had times when you were like, I'm just so frustrated. And you'd have to have someone that just champions you and goes, okay, cool. Yeah, your theory here is awesome. It might not sit in both of these schools here, but how can we find a way to actually make it go forward so that you would actually have your voice and to get to where you are? Which is important to have those. Yeah.
I like to always say, there's an element of when we want things to grow in the earth, it takes earth, but unfortunately, sometimes it also takes the less useful things. From our main perspective of like fertilizer, for example, it does help grow things. And I think we're very good at wanting to focus on the parts that are the good memories and kind of disparage or shame ourselves on things that may not be placed within those areas. I've been talking a lot recently about the issues of shame and how it actually causes people to block their self-development, because it's like, if I feel ashamed of myself, I have like a potential for furthering that in my community, and that impacts me in such a way that I can't see myself in my social standing. And I think that's a real toxic element. I often like to talk when we're engaging with politics that I think shame is actually one of the motivating factors, as well as power, but power being attached to that shame component as to why big nation states do what they do. Because pursuit of power is one thing, but it happens when we think we've been disempowered or we need to be empowered in order to go and control something in our lives. And it's very easy to simplify into one dimension someone else's existence because we are not living in their context. So the inability for us to accept, I suppose, is the yin and the yang. It is those positives and those negatives, and actually see that all things are about learning. And maybe like my area of research was in my master's was about looking at absences and how absences communicate to us. And I use that in the context of grieving. When you're grieving, this is tied to what happened during my master's, which is interesting, which I'm happy to go into as well. But when you're grieving, an absence is actually used unless there's like a non-word. So sometimes we use like ululating or wailing and those terms, or sound itself is a way of demonstrating the inability to be able to fill that gap. And that gap is then honoring that gap. You know, it's honoring those positives and those negatives in those spaces as part of those cycles of life. You know, the period where we have that life and the period where we may go into a season that is like autumn or winter in our existence, and then coming back into the spring and summer again. And for that, the life cycle happens. It was interesting though that when that came out of my master's, that was because there wasn't a champion project. So I went through my
Oh, wow.
period. I went through my period in my undergraduate degree where the work was not defended, and I actually ended up in a very toxic environment and was very discouraging. And then I was given scholarship to go somewhere else to do it, and I was like, okay, I suppose, you know, I don't understand what's going on here, but there you go. Maybe that's one of the absences. And because I study those elements of, you know, looking at these difficulties within human rights violations or the way that the state works, I ended up at Canterbury in 2019. And I think we all kind of know what that means. That year was a full-on year. I mean, I'd already come off the back of being in studies during the period where we had the Don Brash incident, and then we had the feminism 2020 thing. And it was interesting how much social hurt came to the surface and how much poor leadership came to the surface, how much we did not have champions and people felt like they were unable to talk about their own experiences. And then I went to Christchurch and I was in the courses that Anne-Marie Brady was connected with. So we like literally had dangers of the potential of having spies in the class, and the government from overseas, who will remain nameless because we're not here about accusations, were sending death threats to her. And then we had obviously the mosque attack situation, which was horrific. And one of my colleagues was from Palestine, and I remember one of those moments that you were like super sentient and was just standing outside when we managed to actually have that first session to acknowledge what had happened in that space, and her just holding her sister, who was basically weeping in her arms, but she was like, her face was just completely stony, like she didn't have any expression. And it's like these were the two faces of grief in that context, one unable to move and the other unable to, you know, not express themselves in that space. So that's where that master's came from. And funnily enough, it actually happened and originated prior to that happening. It was specifically on how there are false narratives on Islamic militancy in these spaces. And I was literally writing on that day the issues of false representation of Islamic, particularly Islamic men in the context of militancy, is going to lead to hate crime in the West. And then I got a call from a colleague who I was connected with, who was from the UK but living in Christchurch. And he's like, did you hear about the attack? And he basically freaked out because he'd been in the UK during the attacks that were happening in London. So you know, I suspect that a lot of the research I've done has been in connection with grief and grieving and people in situations where they've suffered. But I think that can actually work for good by allowing us not to forget. I think it's one of the academics I work with talks about the power of the testimony. And the testimony is that thing that stands the test of time. He talks about it in the context of the Holocaust. He says how although we get down to the situation where the individual is what is standing, or the community is standing in representation of the potential harm that may have been done in those contexts, they are still standing as that testimony, and that testimony is important to remind us of the things that humanity is capable of, because we're capable of incredible good and we are capable of incredible destruction. And that's what we see at the moment with the cost of living crisis, the climate crisis, all these crises that seem to be occurring. Although I think that's partly the way that we're also conceptualizing our own cycles of burnout in that context too, constant crises. But yeah, it's interesting that you both say that, because I think that's where we see those spaces become spaces where we can actually aid in healing, even though it's been stimulated by something difficult. And I would really encourage people, if you encounter difficulty within your education experience or your life, there is the potential that it may grow into something, which it's done for me, and it's done for a number of people. So not judging it purely on the difficulty itself, is also something that's an important thing to learn, even though it's difficult, and not undervaluing that the difficulty is there. So yeah, it's an interesting situation to be in.
Yeah, it's crazy because, difficulty, grief is on a scale, right? What might be said to you might not be said to me, and we can't undermine that, and I think we have grown up in a narrative or in a nature where if it's not a certain level, then why are you sad? Why are you upset? Or why are you down? And I think that's the narrative that we have to break. That actually doesn't act, like you said before, well, actually any emotion is on a scale. There's any emotions on a scale. And we live in a world where if you don't meet that scale, whatever the scale is, it's not valid. But if we go, let's break away those ceilings and go, actually, it doesn't actually matter. If someone is not happy because they've dropped the ice cream versus someone who's lost somebody, two very different extremes, but at that point in time, that is their grief point at that time, and you can't just push them aside, right? But it's hard, it's hard because you're programmed in a certain way, and you're too busy in your life going, oh, we have this energy in our life, and we go, how am I going to expend my energy? And unfortunately, we've been programmed to expend our energy. Oh, if someone's lost an ice cream, who actually cares? You can buy another ice cream, whatever. As opposed to, it's not about the ice cream, it's about what's happened in that space there. And I can't even imagine. I mean, just to think about you writing that statement about terrorism and how Islamic men were being portrayed, and the mosque shooting happens. I mean, that would have just been such a weird moment for you, because you're writing exactly what is playing out probably down the road from you in a different context. That would have been probably. I don't know what you would have thought about that, because that's just so surreal. You wouldn't have thought that would be happening down the road from you, literally.
Yeah, it's interesting because in our lineage, as I said, with the females of the truth teller, it's actually quite normalized that we perceive things before they happen. And I know within some cultures that is very normal. So I was taught that is traditional. But what was weird on that particular day was I'd been walking home from a meeting with my supervisor when I'd suggested the area of research, which I was incredibly privileged because his background is from the things that happened in Lebanon. So it was very personal for us both to be talking about the realities of what had happened regarding the way that the USA and the UK in particular had responded, and the way that terror law had been created as a result of that, which still has very many discriminatory practices even to this day. I mean, that's what we're seeing, unfortunately, in other countries like China, where the treatment of the Uyghur is happening in that. I'll be honest about that, because that's where we're at. But you like to hope that nation states are welcoming towards their peoples, but sometimes security seems to create divisions. So I'd been walking home the day before, and I really had this moment of, I don't know what to call this piece of research. And I just had this voice in my head that said, you will call it in absentia. That's Latin meaning for those in absence. And it was for those who will not be able to speak for themselves. I just didn't realize when it said that to me in my head at the time, maybe a sense of, the 4D, I suppose. I work with the elements within quantum in my research. I didn't realize that was my neighbors literally like 2 or 3 blocks down the road for me, but it was specifically for some people who were unable to speak. But yeah, it gives you these sentient moments, and I've actually seen a lot of these in politics where we end up almost there's a sort of self-prophecy moment in the context of politics where we live by principles. And it's like in our lives as well, the way that we determine what words we live by, as you said before, or what types of themes we live by, ultimately often do determine the outcome. And so often we're actually making the inference for the outcome in those contexts. I mean, when we look at the situation that led up to those particular attacks, which I don't always like to go through because of the trauma to the community, but the discriminatory practice was already in our security engagement as a nation because of our connection with overseas nation states. And as a consequence, we didn't pick up on those who were potential threats to people in that context because we weren't looking for them. But there were some odd things that happened those days too, like in terms of people being available and acts of courage being able to be incorporated into those spaces. And I think one of the things that it really reinforced to me during that time was that there were people who were willing to stand up, and there were people who were willing to risk even their lives in those contexts. I was working at the time as well with Kate Jews, who went to overseas to the International Court of Justice because she wanted, during the period of the nuclear use, and we've still got too much nuclear use within the Pacific, she really wanted something to be regulated within that space to say nation states are only allowed to use nuclear in this context. And she had, unfortunately, alongside her partner, ended up in circumstances where they'd been targeted by governments as well. So there was really this thematic element. And up until that point, I really hadn't felt like I wanted to be involved in those types of spaces, but I felt like my life was almost like calling me to those places because, you know, I dealt with a lot of human rights-based engagements through my earlier years. I worked with NGOs, I worked with all sorts of different groups like that, and then ended up in the student movement. But that was because of the violations that were happening towards people, whether it was the Don Brash incident or whether it was the things happening in 2019. But I said to myself, I will not lead. I will not lead. I'm not interested in leading. I associate falsely, and this was my shame. I associate leadership often with egotism, and often it is, unfortunately. But yeah, my life really challenged that, and I've ended up in some places where I was like, well, I wasn't intending on being here, but you know, if it gives space for that absence to be able to talk and or even just exist in a context where, you know, it's okay to truth tell on things that are difficult as well as things that we want to celebrate, then maybe there's a positive outcome to some of this, even a positive outcome that I may not always be in control of. And I think that's important to recognize. We are not always in control of our life journey, which is why you have these types of stories in this podcast, because it sometimes goes in places we weren't expecting. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go off there because I'm noticing a theme here, Ellen. Do you want to be in education? Do you want in politics? Didn't want to be a leader. Didn't want to go down the humanitarian pathway. And
I told you I'm an Aquarius.
Exactly. Everything you didn't want to do has happened, right? And
Yeah.
and why I want to talk about that is because, you know, young people out there have this battle that they need to know what they want to do. And sometimes it's just going to come down to your I'm just going to use the word DNA that you know have in your life around you, that you know the education was part of your life, politics part of your life, it was in your DNA. And your life has just stirred you back into it, whether you like it or not. It's come back, and sometimes you have no control. You have no control. It is going to happen because it's just part of you, but you will bring your own flavor into it. You know, you went on a different pathway in your own flavors and your own learnings that come into space here. And this is a great segue into what you do now. So we're not going to talk about titles, we're not, because that's what we're going to avoid. But you now lead the student body, student association, and tell us about that. How has that been for you? Because you represent, I guess, all 8 universities, all the bodies. Is that what's your mandate?
Not
I
all of
guess.
them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I work for the New Zealand Union of Students Associations, and I think you've had some of our colleagues on your show. So thank you for continuing with the whānau. We represent for some of the universities, not all of them. It's been inconsistent in the way that NZUSA has engaged within these spaces, unfortunately, and that's due to politics as well. But we also represent a number of ITPs, which is Institutes of Technology and Polytechnics, and also currently we are repping in connection to 1PTE as well, which is a private training establishment. So yeah, we engage in multiple spaces in that. I worked with NZUSA since 2021. I came in as the National Education Officer, ended up then as the National Research Officer, and am currently the National President, which more titles, but it is what I do, so it's helpful to know. I've been in the student movement since 2017, but I came in as a consultant, not a representative, which seems incredibly backwards, because usually you'd be a representative and then a consultant. But then you go, it's life-like to laugh at me. I don't know why this happened. It just did. And I came in as a consultant because I was doing postgraduate study at the time at Massey University. And my background was in looking, obviously, I'm what's called a metatheoretician, which sounds like a very long and impressive word. And in reality, refers to, I'm someone who works with a thing called metatheory. Metatheory is when you look at the theory of theories, which sounds very much like I'm just saying words on top of words, but that's actually kind of what it is in the investigation of theory. But I look at it in the context of politics and in the context of whether or not, when we look at the lens that we're looking at politics, particularly in the use of violence and state-based violence, if we change the lens from a bigger perspective, if we look at whether or not the lens is structured in a particular way, is that what's actually contributing, like those self-fulfilling prophecies? Is that actually what's also contributing in the way we do things? For example, when a nation state goes, oh, they're likely to be like loading up weapons against us, so we won't agree to this bilateral trade agreement. When they're using that shame component and that power component, are they prioritizing that over putting out the potential for trust in that environment, which then may actually create the outcome that they're afraid of because they have had distrust. So yeah, my background was in that. And so I ended up working for student union. So I worked with Mass University Students Association, University Canterbury Students Association, and then partnered with Victoria University of Wellington Students Association, mainly from like a quality perspective. And then I had some difficulties with the way that scholarship was formed, and actually, unfortunately, a lot of sexism within universities that resulted in some very awful experiences. And I went to the student union back in 2017, and I said, well, these issues are going on. And they said, well, would you represent for the union? And I said, no. And as a result of that, they were like, well, can we get you on committees and boards? So eventually through negotiation, they did end up with me on some committees and boards. So I started off in academic quality, which is where we look at like course structure and how that works. So I was doing a lot of work in that. And then I had a lot of postgrads coming to me saying that they needed advocacy for visa-based issues, for the treatment of the power dynamics between the supervisor and where they're at, and like the direction of their research as well. And as I was the only person who specialized in scholarship-based advocacy, because student unions don't know how to do that, I ended up doing a lot of that. And then when I went to Canterbury, decided to continue doing some support for that because it was moving more into advocacy, and then ended up as the Vice President Advocacy at Victoria University of Wellington Postgraduate Students Association. Then ended up working with NZUSA. So it's like I was thrown around all these different universities, which is a little bit confusing. NZUSA itself has existed for almost 100 years. Actually, ironically, Tony Waho, who my mother trained under, was a part of NZUSA at one point. A number of politicians are also ex-NZUSA representatives. I think we counted in cabinet, I think it was last year, there were 6 or 7 of them. But the politicians across Aotearoa, New Zealand, many of them come from the student movement in some way, shape or form. Our current Prime Minister does, and which we are going to be reminding him of during the general elections period. So yeah, I ended up working and involved with that. I, again, did not have any interest in the leadership position, but I ended up during this period getting voted into the Global Student Union, which is called the Global Student Forum, which is where a lot of my work has been involved with UN agencies and really big conversations with member states concerning like global financing, the way that the poorer nation states are being treated in Africa and parts of Asia. And then have also moved into some of this work again with NZUSA, where I was not just doing quality, but more welfare-based issues. So it's been a very odd journey. It was also funny as well, because I always find this really ironic. When I was in my master's course before I started my PhD, which I was doing at Vic, my master's course, we had all of these. So it's the international relations course, and we had a lot of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade come and actually teach us about UN processes. And I remember this very fancy diplomat who had been in the industry for years, because we're going to call it an industry because that's how they treat it, came and sat down next to me and said, what do you want to do with your life following your work, Ellen? And I said, oh, I'm quite interested in sort of UN spaces because I like international spaces. I always love third culture creation, which is when you and I can't presume that we know how each other is going to function, so we have to create something new together. And he was like, yes, but how are you going to do it if you are not an MFAT? And I was like, I don't know, but we'll see. And only 2 years later, I was actually working within the UN spaces and representation. And I don't even know how I got there. It just happened by accident. But I was like, yeah, I'm not going to sell my soul just for a system that is self-regarding in these spaces. So it was just really ironic. And I just laugh about it because my intention was never to be there just for the sake of being there. It was just, I'm just interested to see how leaders make decisions, mainly because of my cynicism regarding egotism and leadership. So yeah, it was a really strange journey. And I'm just, quite surprised by it myself, and love the ironies of existence that continue to pop up.
It's so beautiful, and it's beautiful because it's, I work in the space where young people they have a linear methodology that life is going to go this way here. But every single one of our guests, I don't think we've had any guests on this podcast that's had a linear journey. No one's had a linear journey. Everyone's had a journey that's gone this way or that way and that way. And a bit like, I like how you said, you want to work for the UN and somebody says to you, you've got to work to MFAT first, but you're like, I don't actually have to do that. This is what your perception is. But no, hey,
Yeah,
buddy,
yeah.
I'm going to get there in a different way. And it's interesting because it's again pushing the status quo. You know, the shoulds,
Mm.
you should work for empathy. No, you can actually, I'm going to challenge the status quo. But I love how, again, back to the DNA, you know, the fact that you're with NZ Students Association and Tony
Mm.
Waho was part of that. It's quite cyclical how that's happened for you. And
Yeah.
whether you want to be a leader or not, you're in this role here. And what I really resonated when I was reading your profile on LinkedIn the other day was the stuff that you do in the global movement. And out of interest, you know, and for listeners as well, the world is a amazing place. And you mentioned it before. You know, the disparity is just
Mm.
ridiculous, right? The disparity, whether we like it
Mm.
or not, there's disparity. But is there a common thread that you see when you go to these meetings with your colleagues from around the world and at that forum? Is there a theme that you notice that doesn't actually matter where you are in the world? There's one or two themes that it doesn't matter whether you're from New Zealand or from Mexico or from Zimbabwe or from. Is there any themes that stand up for you?
There is one resounding theme, Prajesh, and that is there is a groaning among the young people to be free.
Yeah,
And
what
they
does that
don't feel
mean?
like they feel like, you know, it's what we saw in the rhetoric of, you know, the climate activism that's happened. It's been in the rhetoric of, you know, the cost of living crisis, the mental health crisis. It is, why are we in systems and structures that are not prioritizing people, they're prioritizing human capital? Why are we in education systems that treat us as a consumer when we want to learn how to live and be? You know, it's that element of we believe in a pedagogy that is liberating. Why are we not focusing on liberation? Why has the liberal project sold us commercialism and systems instead of freedom, which they promised us? So the global student movement stands in that space, looking to governments that are focused on deregulation in these spaces. And NZUSA is no different in this context, where it's like we've been turned into numbers. I actually remember saying that to Massey University. You know, this is, I will be honest about it, I do suspect this is a version of neocolonization, and it's particularly impacted minority communities, Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, those who have disabilities, those who are older, you know, retirees. It's connected with the young in particular, who are now like debt bound in their early years before they're even able to begin to live. They wonder what their future is with a global earth that's warming up, with political leaders who don't outlast lettuces. You know, there is a question. I think it's an existential question. And by that, I mean existentialism. I don't just mean will we exist? I mean, it is, who are we? You know, we were sold this individualizing narrative when international trade came along, which is like you're a global citizen. But what did that actually mean? That just reinforced national borders. And, you know, I think there is a sense of, there's this beautiful line, which is, you know, we don't save up the earth for ourselves, we give it as a gift to our children. And I suspect that's the mentality that's been lacking. We're seeing a hoarding in the space. Like when we look at big tech companies, when we look at large corporations trying to expand over boundaries, there's this sense of take what you can while you can before it runs out. You know, it's a extreme version of capitalism, not a healthy one. And these global spaces with students recognize that there is a degree of exploitation in these types of narratives these days. And there is a desire to transcend those things. And although we have our political differences, I think they will not be satisfied for anything less than their freedom and the democracy that they were promised. And by that, I don't mean a democracy that's just determined by those in power, but a democracy that supports grassroots initiatives, communities. I had a very good comment from a colleague from one of the iwi recently that said, but whose democracy is it? You know, whose democracy is it when democracy has always been defined by those in positions of power? So, and NZUSA is no different. Only it's reaching that level of, we have such an intersectional public and still are dealing with the true grievances and the grief of colonization and the treatment of peoples within these spaces. And also on the flip side, still dealing with you know, those working class mentalities, which does make us fear if anyone gets ahead. I think we've got those two sides of these things. We have got people who have been genuinely treated poorly, and then we've also got this fear of people succeeding, just in case it makes our society look unequal again. But I think it ties back into that we really just want that freedom to be able to learn, the whole philosophy of education, which was meant to be go on your journey, explore, rather than go on your journey and ensure that you pay your fees on time, of which is important, but become the focus. So, yeah.
Exactly. Oh, and that's so beautiful. It's interesting because I love the fact that there's a common theme that's across the work that you do, where freedom is not defined according to freedom. I want to just break free. It's about the freedom that was promised to you. You have this promise of when you get education, this is what it's going to allow you to do. But again, who's defined that, right? The definition of freedom has now changed from those that create our institutes versus those that actually want that freedom. And a question I have for you is, working in the political sphere, you spoke about nations, but increasingly the question I have for you is, do you feel in your space or in the work that you do that nations are actually not as powerful anymore? Because as you mentioned before, you've got the corporations are now actually bigger than the nations. For example, there's some corporations that their earnings every day are bigger than some countries' GDP. That's what's because their play in this whole political sphere is totally different, because they don't reply to the people. They respond to their shareholders who just want money, right? It's all about the bottom dollar. How do you see that playing out? This is because it's a different world. This is still crazy where you have your Jeff Bezos of the world or whoever, really.
That's a very interesting question. I think a lot of people have been asking it. I think it's also partnered with the question that a lot of people have been asking, which is, what is the relevance of the nation state anymore? Although then we see the pandemic happen and we're like, oh, now we can see the relevance of the nation state because borders are very clear all of a sudden, state of emergency, and all of a sudden we see borders again, and trade changes again, so we don't have that sort of bilateral, multilateral engagement in the same way. So I suspect that we may have been sold a version of globalization that may not have fully existed, and the sort of liberal project argument, which was idealized and not actually realized. But it's a really interesting question that you ask, because first of all, I'd like to say, when you're in the UN system, which is a very convoluted system, I think everyone thinks when you hit that UN space that you've somehow made it. The answer is totally not true. You have not made it. You've just entered into an environment of public relations, and that is most of what it is. Because when you're in that space, you can see that the nation states actually hold massive amounts of power and are still able to do a whole lot in that space, which is what you're seeing in the moment with the war in Ukraine, from both sides of the argument in that space. In terms of big tech companies or, those big corporations, your Amazon, your Facebook, I think it's an interesting environment, because there's been the question as to whether or not they're trying to create sort of digital nation states and digital citizenship that sort of transcends that space. But I also think that we need to realize that the majority of these big corporations have then attempted to try and get people into politics, because they're not lawmakers and they're not international policy makers and they're not sovereign states. And we still work in the structure of the sovereign state, which still has a question mark around it, in all honesty, because when you look at, UNDRIP, for example, which supports the rights of Indigenous peoples, it endorses nation states to notice that there are communities that are sovereign within the sovereign state. So we've got a full another type of conversation going on there, which is really interesting to talk about. But what has happened is most of these organizations have then attempted to sort of interbreed into politics by placing, which is why you see in the States we've got these massive lobbying organizations, placing their key powers within nation states to be able to then influence decision making in legislation and policy. I mean, it's happened, for example, when we think about war profiteering, a number of those representatives, I remember reading within the UK, moved from being in this position of working for an arms company, some of the big ones. I won't name them because, again, we're not about accusing, but then they'll go and move into a government job. And that sort of intersection and moving between those two really does limit our ability to actually think of big tech and big corporations as having an independence from that space. And I know that actually UN entities have come and said to me, we're always trying to balance that engagement between private sector and public sector. And that's always an ongoing conversation as to what that looks like, because there are advantages in these big corporations in terms of accessibility to things, innovation in spaces. And I think sometimes we sensationalize their innovation in those spaces. I mean, they do contribute to technology, which is still interesting and can be used for good because it's just a tool, and that tool can be used in whatever way. And the question is whether or not, the manipulation of our political systems, whether or not our political systems are right, is an authentic representation of supporting people or just supporting self-interest.
Yeah, there's no easy answer to that, right? And I love the fact that nation states still have power. It's just when you look at the media, and because the media, I mean, many of the world looks at the media, and the media just portrays a story that you want to hear. Like right at the start, you mentioned the word crisis. We love a crisis. Humans love a crisis, right? Everyone loves a crisis. So you just speak about these things here, and big tech or big firms, Coca-Cola, they're all big firms. They've been around for a long time, and they've done some good as well in the world. We always look at the bad stuff that they do. Everyone is bad. Like I said, humans can do good and bad, and sometimes we focus on the bad and forget about the good. That's human nature, right? Like Julius Caesar, William Shakespeare, the good that men do is oft, the goes at the bad lives long after them, right? That was one of the quotes in Julius Caesar, which is powerful, and it's always remember. But it's really a good way to talk about this. There's no good or bad. It's just we have to look at things in different contexts. And it's all about context. Everything we do is about context. It's not just about a big, massive thing and everything's the same everywhere you go. It's contextualized. And that's the beauty, but also the struggle about contextualization and understanding that there. And we've been speaking for almost an hour and 20 minutes. You have some amazing stories here. But I just want to go on, if you don't mind. I just want to touch on, you spoke earlier on about in your master's there was some grief that happened. Do you want to elaborate on that, or was it something you don't want to talk about?
Oh, no, it's fine. I think it was a way of really summarizing the things that were happening in the context of those around me. The way that the theory works that I was using is actually a thing called, as I said, deconstruction, which was put towards some work that a guy called Jacques Derrida did, which was specifically towards, he called it, which is a very odd sort of way of calling it, putting language together for the madman, or for ones in difficulty, which he says most of society rejects, but may actually be quite useful. And I see it's interesting that you quote Shakespeare, because he often used the position of the fool in order to provide some type of truth that is sort of a revelation to the community, but is also part of the key storytelling element. So that was really allowing a space to use the work that Derrida was engaged with to try and talk about how difficulty within human rights violations actually can aid our understanding of the nation states and aid our understanding of the way that we're approaching policy and the biases that we take towards it. I used it in the research in two contexts. One of those was in analysis of the Islamic State, which is ISIL, and engagement in that space. And then the other one was to do with Boko Haram and the treatment of young women during the period of the Chibok abduction. So it was an opportunity to actually look in gaps in our sort of storytelling. And I think you're very right when you say that the media is very focused on that crisis type of narrative, because I think, as I said, the element of sensationalizing is it's really nice to try and condense complexity down into something that is a bite-sized piece of information that you can just sort of absorb in a moment, rather than, and I feel like this is really what the post-truth era has become. I was reading a really good book recently, which was looking at that element of everyone now uses the language of authenticity because the statement has become more important than the person. So like, this is who I am, as the statement, maybe like the social media you were talking about, has become much more of a priority than who the person is and their actual essence, or their lived experience, or just their encounters that they take. The grieving is an opportunity to bring that back, where you can acknowledge even difficult circumstances. And that was what I was trying to focus on, it compared to humanitarian reports of, those who've been displaced in Iraq and Syria and things like that, and the impact on Nigeria, which was completely being misrepresented by the media during that period in time. And then moved into my PhD, which focuses on maybe the way that we're looking at violence within nation states is incorrect, not because violence is not something that's very negative, because it is, it does impact people in those spaces, but maybe the way that it's been sensationalized to create power or manipulate people to kind of believe in these sort of societal structures, which we call biopolitics, forcing them to do certain things at certain times to pretend like this is a mode of citizenship when actually it's a mode of security. Which is funny because that ties into education as well, because unfortunately often we get sold that, you know, going through the methods of the performance of education is the same thing as education, which personally I don't believe. We hold within the international student movement that education is a human right. And we also hold that tertiary education is a human right. And that is the purpose of why education is there, to aid the betterment of society, rather than focusing on narrow perspectives in that.
That's beautiful. I mean, I love how you said that, because education is a right? It's a right, but we've taken that away. It's not a right anymore, you know, for a lot of, if you can't afford it. I grew up in Zimbabwe. I grew up in Africa, and if you don't have the money, you can't go to tertiary. Full stop. It doesn't matter. There's no social welfare. It's simple. No money, you can't do it. And you know, it's the world's a different place, right? And you need money in some places, and some places don't. But we have these barriers, right? Straight away. Once you put up a barrier, you know, it's just something that should be accessible. But and I guess the world has changed. We go back to our big tech friends. You know, they have enable freedom of education. Anyone can access. As long as you've got access to the internet or electricity, first of all, before you get the internet, you have that. Then education's out there. You know, it's not stuck into your traditional brick and mortar systems, which is how you have your Coursera's or your edX. They're now just, you know, fantastic tools, and some of them are free. You know, but you've got to have access to that. And again, it comes down to, hey, you have access to the information, but if you don't have ability to access electricity, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If you have no way to access a device, doesn't actually matter, you know? If you don't have the time because you're too busy trying to feed and help your family, doesn't matter, right? So it goes back to your theme of, hey, freedom is not just about freedom to be educated, or freedom about just living a life that is where you can authentically live yourself. Using the word authentically, you know, it all ties it really well there. Ellen, we could keep talking for hours and hours, and you know, we might get you back on the podcast again another time. But our podcast is called Boss Knowledge, and the way we like to round off our podcast is, we'd love to ask our guests to give our listeners, and myself and Tane, one piece of knowledge that you'd like them to take away from your lived experience, which you may have spoken about today or not spoken about today, so they can just take it away and put it into their basket of knowledge as they listen to the podcast.
Yeah, I think probably one of those elements that's standing out to me the most in this space that is of value is, you know, the surprising is meant to shape you. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The things that you say no to, no may not be the right word. It may be not now rather than no. Some things are a genuine no, but allowing yourself to explore is at the essence of what that freedom is, and not being harsh to oneself in that discovery process, because the journey within that basket of knowledge is a journey. And that means that you're going to go past a lot of landmarks on the way, and some of those will be nice landmarks and others of those will not always be nice landmarks. But allowing yourself to explore not only your identity but the world that you are in, with the people you are around, without judgment towards yourself or others, is actually probably that first step towards a legitimate power as opposed to an illegitimate one.
That's so beautiful that, you know, there's so much in there. And I guess, you know, it's, hey, you know, life doesn't go hunky-dory. It throws you a couple of curveballs, and those curveballs will come, and accept and expect those surprises. And you're a living example of that there. And you know, you're a living example of all these things that have happened in your life, which if you said that to 10-year-old Ellen, that this is going to happen to you, probably like, what are you talking about? This is not the way I'm living my life. And you know, life is just throwing these things to you, and you were doing what you meant to do from your DNA perspective, as opposed to from your title perspective. Thank you very much. Tana, any last words for Ellen?
No, it's just been an amazing podcast, and I'm sure I'm going to have to go back and listen to it again to, you know, really take out all the messages and all the stories that you've given us. And I think, you know, just reflecting on that last point, you know, sometimes we think about these challenges and people telling us that we can't do things, or that we need to change the way we are doing things, and we often see it as, you know, such a negative or such a burden, and that, oh, maybe we shouldn't be doing these things. But it's almost, you know, through that you truly learn what your values are and whether you want to pursue those. Because, you know, sometimes it's that person standing there as a barrier is actually your biggest growth, because it enables you to go, actually, I'm going to do it anyway, and, you know, I'm going to challenge the system. And that's what, you know, that's where all new ideas really spark from, is that challenge of, what is acceptable. And yes, it means being open-minded too. It doesn't mean it's my way or the highway, but it's, having this understanding that not always challenges are meant to be bad, and just because somebody says no to you doesn't mean that's the end of the story.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Tane.
Oh, beautiful, Tane. Beautiful. Exactly. Yeah. Sometimes your barriers is your greatest wealth. Beautiful. Ellen, thank you so much for jumping on our podcast today. There's so much wisdom there, so much knowledge, so much experience there that you've shared, which, like you said, if we had this as a 5-minute sensationalistic news topic, we'd never get this. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And I'm sure our listeners out there are going to gain a lot from this year. So listeners out there, please feel free to connect with Ellen if you'd like to. She has some amazing stuff, like I said, on LinkedIn that I really, really appreciate. And hopefully you've taken away something. If you haven't, then please listen to the podcast again, because there should be something you all take away from the podcast today. And as you do that there, we would love to say, please make sure you keep smiling. Find something always to put into your basket of knowledge, whether it is tiny or big. Fill it up with something, and feel free to share this podcast with anyone that you think is going to learn something from it. Until next time, thank you very much. Ka kite, and bye, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Baskets of Knowledge.
Yeah, we hope that you found something useful to put into your basket of knowledge. And as we said before, remember to put something little into your baskets of knowledge every week. And as always, feel free to like, comment, and share this podcast. Thanks, everybody. Bye.